Howdy out there, folks. This is Darius Dale here to present our macro minute for Wednesday, April 20th, 2022. Starting with markets, we got stocks up this morning, mostly commodities mixed with crude oil leading, crypto up, dollar down, global bond yields down. Market moving headlines with the yen up nearly a full percent on the dollar after the Bank of Japan offered to buy an unlimited amount of bonds to contain yields. This is their yield curve control program. Talked about this on the last couple of Real Vision daily briefings. I'll be on this Wednesday to unpack some of these dynamics. The bonds gained globally on the BOJ signal, despite hawkish rhetoric from other central bankers. So you had Chuck Evans out from Chicago Fed on Tuesday saying interest rates will probably exceed the neutral level over the next year or so. ECB's governing council member Martin Kazaks said the ECB could raise rates potentially as soon as July amid a significant inflation risk. China sort of joining the PB, or sort of kind of incrementally hawkish, if you go, relative to expectations, certainly. The PBOC held its 1-year and 5-year loan prime rates at 3.7% and 4.6% respectively. Economists were calling for 5 basis point cuts for each. China also came out yesterday. Vice Foreign Minister Li Yucheng said the relationship with Russia remains solid and they're going to continue deepening strategic ties. So on the margin, this is negative for a geopolitical standpoint, obviously, with respect to Russia and Ukraine, but it also, as long as they continue building strategic replies and China can assure its supply of crude oil, supply of certain grains and agricultural commodities, it increases the probability that we see some aggression towards Taiwan over the medium to long term here. Big news this morning in U.S. markets. Netflix down 27% after reporting a drop in its subscriber base. When you're in these bear markets, there's always the big companies that come out and kind of, from the bubble, whatever the bubble sector was, they always come out and kind of report the beginning of the end for that sector. You go back to 2000, it was Qualcomm. You go back to 2007, it was Bear Stearns. You got Facebook and Netflix puking already year to date. So let's keep our eyes on this. From a Fed speak perspective, you got Mary Daly and Chicago President Pred Evidence, San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly out Wednesday. Get the French presidential election debate, Macron versus Le Pen. Go back to 2016. You remember that third presidential debate with Trump and Hillary Clinton? I walked out of a bar saying I think Trump's going to win this election. Le Pen, all eyes are on Le Pen as it relates to her ability to morph to wield some of the zeitgeist over there in Europe as it relates to inflation, as it relates to globalization. We'll see that later today. And then lastly, you got Powell, Lagarde coming out tomorrow at the IMF event. Preliminary PMIs Friday morning, and then Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey out Friday morning as well. Big movers this morning: Japanese yen 0.8% up, Shanghai Composite minus 1.3%, and then you have 10-year yields, Bund yields, German Bund yields, Swiss yields, UK gilt yields, Treasury yields off 6 to 7 basis points apiece on the BOJ move. Shifting gears to the charts this morning, U.S. dollar still bullish, fams. Foolish from the perspective of our volatility adjusted momentum signal. Kind of a fair fight from a probable range perspective. We got minus 1.1% of downside versus 0.9% of upside. Gold neutral VAMs minus 2.5% of downside versus 2.1% of upside. 10-year nominal treasury yield bullish VAMs minus 29 basis points of downside versus 15 basis points of upside. High yield OAS credit spreads here. Bullish VAMs still minus 30 basis points of downside versus 16 basis points of upside. S&P 500 neutral VAMs bouncing off the lower boundary of its probable range. Now you got somewhat of a fair fight there, minus 3% of downside versus 3.4% of upside. VIX bouncing off the upper boundary of its probable range, minus 31% of downside versus 16% of upside. NASDAQ 100 neutral VAMs also bouncing off the lower boundary of its probable range. You got minus 3.6% of downside versus 6.4% of upside. Russell 2000 neutral VAMs minus 4.7% of downside versus 3.4% of upside. Bitcoin neutral VAM still also bouncing off the lower boundary of its probable range with minus 8% of downside versus 6% of upside. Ethereum neutral VAM, same deal, bouncing off the lower boundary of its probable range, minus 9% of downside versus 8% of upside. So somewhat of a fair fight in crypto this morning. Shanghai Composite, this again does not look like a chart of a central bank, a major central bank that's about to go on an amazing easing initiative. Bearish VAMs, minus 2.7% of downside versus 3.8% of upside. WTI crude oil neutral VAMs, minus 13% of downside versus 9% of upside. And then lastly, ag neutral VAMs, minus 5.9% of downside versus 0.4% of upside. Be aware of that if you're long ag. And then industrial metals, neutral VAMs, minus 2.7% of downside versus 4.1% of upside. So with that, Darius Dale presenting our macro minute for Wednesday, April 20th, 2022. Best of luck out there today.